Okay, let's talk about political parties. Chapter 11 is just packed full of a lot of information about party systems around the world, so let's get into that. A political party is a formal organization that has several purposes that we'll talk about, several functions. The political party provides an opportunity for citizens to coalesce in this organization, that to have the similar like-minded views or similar views on how the society should be directed. So the party, when people coalesce and vote for that party has a goal of winning control of the government and maintaining power over the government and its policies and influencing the direction of policy, so that therefore the policy that gets generated from the government has the view that that party values, the view of the world that they share, or the type of policies that group of people prefers in directing their society. So very important part of politics. James Madison, while he was writing the Federalist Papers, was talking about this problem of factions that we've touched on just a little bit before. And he considered political parties yet another faction. But he did change his tune on that fairly quickly, as the parties began to coalesce very quickly in our system, and they provided an avenue or an outlet for people to come together in determining the leadership and direction of government. So the party bears the cost of bringing together this constituency of like-minded, or at least loyal-minded citizens who agree with that. And it also provides a clear choice for them to vote for, almost like a prepackaged ideology that they can use without necessarily having to be completely and totally informed or knowledgeable about policy or about the details of that ideology. They can vote for that package and feel satisfied. The party also serves to nominate and recruit candidates. It's very difficult to get elected in America unless you have that major party and its machinery, so to speak, behind you in order to get elected. We'll talk about that in more detail here in a minute. Now, before democracy, the leaders were pretty much born, or they took over, or they bought their way into the office through bribery, or got appointed to it by kings and emperors and that sort of thing. But after democracy, particularly the United States was the primary form of democracy that everybody emulates to a certain degree, that we've talked about before. And so therefore, one of the major functions of a democracy, or major conditions for democracy, is to hold elections. Therefore, clubs of people, or what Madison might have originally referred to as factions, they form into larger and larger, into nationwide organizations, and they can raise money and then support candidates. And then as more and more people come together with like-minded views as to how we want the world to be, then they can use that money to form these organizations and get their candidates elected. So as suffrage expanded, as more and more people came to vote and our population got bigger and bigger, the candidates rely more on these election agents, the parties, in other words, that help them get elected. And then early on, up until the late 1800s, the parties in the United States pretty much controlled the voting booths as well. They printed their own ballots, and so when you went to vote, you actually picked it up. You picked up one of those parties' ballots, so therefore everybody knew who you were voting for when you walked into the voting booth, because you were carrying that party's ballot. And that changed in the late 1800s with what they call the Australian ballot, which made it secret with all the parties printed on one ballot. It may sound fairly insignificant to us today, but that was a pretty major turning point, so to speak, in making our elections a little bit more inclusive. The party also stimulates their voters to go to the polls. It does generate a show of support for government, particularly through our view of the world and through our preferences of policies. The party also recruits and socializes its future leaders. This is probably even more noticeable in the British system, where from the ground up, the party members start very early on doing lesser tasks, and then are elected to some leadership at a local level, and then they demonstrate their faithfulness and their loyalty to the party, become a spokesperson, become fairly well known, and establish name recognition, and then potentially winning an internal election as a party leader. And then if your party gets control of that parliament, then you would be prime minister. So I just described what Margaret Thatcher did, for example, from the ground up, coming all the way through the party ranks up into becoming the prime minister as the leader of that party. Now, in the United States, believe it or not, parties are somewhat weaker organizationally as far as having the power as to developing or nurturing candidates. Also, the primaries take quite a bit of this selection out of the hands of the party leaders. So the primary system, which has come in full scale just in the past 30 or 40 years or so, means that, again, in the United States, we're focusing more on the person rather than the party. A fairly interesting example of how less power the parties have as far as who the candidates are is even shown in this election, where on both sides of the political spectrum we had candidates such as Bernie Sanders on the Democratic side, who prior to the election was not actually a Democrat. He was an independent, but he had to run as a Democratic candidate in order to have a chance of getting elected, as we'll talk about here in a minute, but gave Hillary Clinton a pretty good challenge in the primary, but was not even technically a Democrat prior to the election. And then again, on the other side of the spectrum, President Donald Trump was not necessarily a strong Republican Party member prior to the election. In fact, he changed party membership many times over the last 10, 15 years. He becomes a Republican again to run for president, and makes it all the way to the party's candidate. So that shows you how we are a little bit more looking at the person as opposed to the party in America. And then in one-party states, the membership of the party is very much restricted. It's very much of a secret as to who gets to be a party member and have to express undying loyalty, so to speak. And China's Communist Party makes up only 5% of the population, but they have total control over more than 1 billion people as to the direction that their country's going to take. Now, the party does provide a source of political identity. We already talked about that loyalty to a party is the strongest predictor of who you're going to vote for. About 1/3 of Americans will vote for the Democratic candidate no matter what. About 1/3 of Americans will vote for the Republican Party no matter who it is. And so therefore that helps to build a political community, which provides for, I guess you'd say, cooperation and solidarity within those communities, but it can also provide divisiveness and polarization between these communities, which we are kind of seeing in America. And we do know, as part of the socialization process, much of this party identity is passed on from your parents, and it stays with you long term. In many cases, it stays with a person their entire lives, and because of that's what they were raised to believe. The party, along with its major goals of winning control of the government, has this channel of control, particularly in these legislative bodies where the lawmaking is done. In the United States in particular, the party that's in power, the party that has the majority number of members in whether it's the Senate or the House, also gets to make the committee assignments. And most importantly, the chairman of those committees is a member of the majority party. So that's why it's extremely important for a party to win control of that House in order to have pretty much total control over gatekeeping as to what comes out of the committees as far as bills getting out on the floor. The party has control of that every step of the way. Also, as far as the president party goes, the president nominates departments and it has to be approved by the Senate, but obviously the president is going to select people who are loyal to his party, loyal to his agenda. So there's where another element of control from the president's end. He nominates people for offices with his appointments of department heads they're going to be sympathetic to his party. And of course, a lot of back scratching, also known as log rolling, occurs within the party in order to maintain that solidarity. If you support us with this bill, obviously we'll support you on your bill. The party leadership in these houses pretty much knows how the vote's going to go even before they conduct the vote because of all this communication and solidarity between party members. And then, of course, the chance to advance to powerful positions is a function of your seniority in that party. Now, as I said, in the United States, party organization is somewhat more loose and informal. It does not require membership card to be a member of that party. Now, there are some organizations that collect dues for fundraising. A lot of it is basically run on donations. We'll talk about that here in a minute. And as you can see here on the local level, both parties have organizations that you can join and get actively involved in for either the major parties, for example. Now in the UK, we already talked about how the party organization is more pervasive from the ground up. The members actually form constituency organizations that determines local policy. In the American system, these local committees can actually create their own local platforms. Then that goes to the state convention, and they put together a state platform. And then the national convention is taking those pieces, and they come together with a national platform. So it kind of works its way up as well. However, in the UK, for example, they determine local policy and then send delegates to the annual conference. And then the central office hires local party agents. The central office, we'll talk more about that later on, is part of the parliamentary system where the party in control of government also establishes a central office that does all the administrative functions, as well as a management board that is a function of the party in control of the parliament. We'll talk more about the parliament later on, but this just gives you a general idea of how party organization is a little bit more unified in the UK because of that parliament system where the party, you're literally voting for the party, remember, and the party that wins control of that chamber pretty much has total control to pass the legislation that it said it was going to do. A little bit more loosely organized in the United States, but still very important for that party to win control of that chamber just the same. Let's talk about some political party systems. Now, one party system is not quite the same as the single party dominant authoritarian system that we've talked about a few times before. A one party system means that's it. There's no other opportunities for any other parties to exist, such as in China, in Syria, for example, where they are the only party available, and it's little more than a dictatorship in a way, but it's a dictatorship through a party ideology. And so the ultimate goal is total control of government as far as operation, communication, even controlling the media, even controlling the economic resources as much as possible. A few examples there of one-party system. Now, the dominant party system is more like that single-party authoritarian system that we've talked about before, where there are other parties that serve as perhaps outlets for criticism, but the dominant party maintains its power year after year after year through that system of patronage that we talked about. In Mexico, for example, the PRI party won the election every election with 60 to 70% of the vote. At one point, the president garnered almost 90% of the vote. So clearly that shows that from the ground roots on up, an entire civil service on up, has ties to the party and maintains its loyalty. There's favoritism going in both directions in order to maintain the party's power, as well as promising jobs in favors, kickbacks, whatever, that maintain the party in power. Now, dominant party systems have also been associated with independence movements, such as when Gandhi inspired the revolution for independence of India from the British Empire. Very popular, very charismatic, and inspired an entire ideological movement around him that formed a political party that stayed in power for a long time because of the legacy that Gandhi had started. And so, particularly from the start, there was less internal disagreement that allowed a dominant party to maintain control for quite a while. Now, the two-party system, such as in the United States, we'll talk about it here in more detail in a second. The two parties typically share over 90% of the votes, but it's rarely a landslide. Typically, neither get more than 55 to 60% of the vote. So because you only have two-party choices, it maintains somewhat of a distinct polarization there. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. We like to complain about our two-party system with not much choice, but there are some advantages to it. Neither party tends to hold power for very long. That is almost like a defense mechanism where when the public sees the party's been in control for 8 years and not much has happened, or it's stagnated, or the economy's sluggish, well, let's let the swing voters in particular will say, well, let's switch gears and put the other party in power and let's see what they do. So with this a certain amount of choice, it has remained fairly stable. There's other things in America, obviously, that contribute to our stability. But the two-party system, the fact that it tends to balance each other out. When one party gets stale, the voters put the other one in power. So that does have an advantage to a certain degree. There's also pressure on both parties to appeal to as many groups as possible. So they're trying to absorb and in some cases try to moderate their positions, particularly on the eve of an election, to try to maximize their voters. That makes them perhaps a little bit more all-encompassing. With the two-party system, there's no need to rely on the potentially unstable coalitions in order to try to get a party to align with some smaller parties in order to have over 50% of that particular house. So the two-party system doesn't necessarily have to deal with that, but we do see quite a bit of polarization that has grown in the last decade or so in our two-party system. And we've already talked about how these single-member districts are conducive to two-party systems, so that just brings me to my next point. Why does the United States have a two-party system? There's nothing that's written. There's nothing that says that we have to have a two-party system. And it's the main reason we have these two major parties is because it's for structural reasons. The single-member districts, as I've said before, these are in the Constitution. The Constitution lays this out, that one representative is elected from each of the districts. So therefore, there's no incentive for a third party to try to vie for that second member or that third member for that district. There's only one candidate, there's only one representative that's going to be coming from that district. So really only two parties have an incentive to try to compete for that one spot. So that settled out fairly quickly. Now, another thing that is conducive to the two-party system is our electoral college. This was a way to try to buffer a president from gaining too much power through a popular vote. Now, we can certainly argue about the electoral college, whether it's really needed all that much. I would talk about that more in another class, such as American government. But there's 538 electoral votes in the electoral college, and that number comes from the state's combined numbers of representatives plus their 2 senators. And the president needs to get 270 of those electoral votes to win the election. So therefore, a significant third-party candidate could seriously hinder any one of those candidates from getting a majority. And when a candidate does not get a majority of those electoral votes, it gets kicked in the House. And the House has to decide who the president was, and that happened very early on in our history. The election of 1800, that happened. It got thrown into the House. It was a big mess. It actually inspired the 12th Amendment, where the voting got tweaked a little bit, but they they kept the majority requirement in there. So therefore, the two parties settled out very quickly, because in order to avoid the election getting thrown into the House every time, really there's only two viable parties that would really be competing for that office. So it's settled into that very quickly. And the states also kind of aided to this with this winner take all requirement, which almost all states have. Whoever gets most of the popular votes in that state, they will get all of that state's electoral votes. And so therefore that really takes away any proportional voting type of representation there. It's also going to really enforce the fact that only two parties can effectively negotiate this electoral college, so that one of them is going to get a majority of the votes. Now, another thing that helps maintain the two-party system is this concept of gerrymandering, where the state legislatures redraw the districts every 10 years when the new census comes out. The party that's in power of that state has final say on how the districts get drawn, and that party that's in control of that state will draw the districts to ensure that that party will get elected again from that district. So they redraw the districts in order to make sure that demographically their party is still going to have the majority in those districts. Third parties, as I've already mentioned, have numerous obstacles. It's very difficult for them to win the electoral vote for president. Also, the major parties, because of their entrenched power, can absorb a third-party platform. Third parties are typically started on single issues that don't garner a whole lot of universal support, and they are typically short-lived as a result of these reasons. Ballot restrictions are put on third parties to where they have to have a certain number of petitions to get on the ballot, and many times they can't garner enough petition signatures. And then I've also talked about how the swing voters, which could anywhere be from 5 to 10% of the electorate, are aware that they're wasting their vote if they vote for a third party. Now, again, that doesn't mean to disparage somebody who votes for a third party. But most people are very much aware that they're voting for a candidate that's not going to win. And that's what we call wasting their vote, in quotation marks. It's a figure of speech. So therefore, swing voters who want to make a difference are saying, well, I'm going to swing to the other major party and get them elected because the party has been in there long enough. Let's switch gears. So they are less likely to waste their vote, so to speak, on a third party candidate when they can literally swing the election to the other party. Now, here's an example of a gerrymandered district, about as convoluted as you can get. This district is the 3rd Congressional District in Maryland, clearly drawn in order to make sure that the constituency of this district is going to continue to vote for the majority party that's in power of that state. Now, talking about the multi-party system, again, because we talked about that with parliaments and proportional representation systems. Norway, for example, has 7 parties, 169 seats in their Congress. 3 parties form a coalition of 86 seats. So that's kind of, we touched on that a little bit last week with proportional representation systems, where you have a wider range of choice, and through these coalitions, smaller parties can actually share some of the power. Now, again, coalitions can be unstable. They can fracture along those party lines. Italy, for example, has had 62 different coalitions since 1945. So while the proportional representation systems can provide some benefits and advantages and perhaps attraction that we could see from our point of view in a two-party system, there's obviously disadvantages with it as well. So no system is perfect, and if you've been socialized into these systems, they're more likely going to stay, those types of systems. Now, how does the party finance itself? Well, typically in many regions, membership dues are paid. We already mentioned that donations from individuals and interest groups is, particularly in the United States, the biggest source of revenue for party organizations. There is the option of public finance. That has not gained much attraction in the United States because of our more individualistic attitudes in the United States of not wanting the government to be involved in many aspects of our life. This would require that we would, I guess you could say, volunteer some of our taxes to the public finance system, and then the candidates would get an equal share of that public finance. Now, again, that takes away a lot of the money of wealthy donors and corporations out of the mix. There's a lot of appeal to that because we do seem to get a lot of criticism in the United States of campaigns being financed by a very small percentage, a smaller and smaller percentage of donors with a lot of wealth and power and money that can finance candidates and finance party organizations. So there is some appeal to spreading that out, almost requiring less money because they're certainly not going to be able to get as much if they have to rely on public finance. So they're therefore not as attractive in the United States. Now, of course, the single party system uses more of this patronage system of promises, favors, bribes, and kickbacks. Not quite as much finance needed there if you've got loyalty that's going to keep you getting reelected, and then you will pay that back in terms of other favors. Subsidies, which the government provides. Some foreign countries subsidize parties that further their own policies. Now, that may sound even more political than what we have, where a government would subsidize their own party, but there could be possibilities of government subsidizing some, in general, party finances in order to try to make it as fair and balanced as possible, much like the public finance type option. How do parties progress? Well, since parties are made up of human beings, these human beings coalesce into structures and leaderships. Well, we do see that leaders tend to develop their own set of values that could, shape the party over time. The incentive for a party, of course, no matter how it starts, is to grow as large as possible. We've already talked about how they're trying to absorb as many constituents groups as possible without going against their platform that they have at their base that people appeal to, and they will try to maximize as many people as they can to get in there. But it also has a tendency for them to moderate their position as they get larger in order to maintain and keep those large numbers of voters, because the electorate, as large as it is, has a greater mass of people in the middle than it does out on the fringes. And that's why we see during the primary season the candidates are appealing more to the base constituents, and as we get closer to the general election, they start to appeal broader and broader. As the party gets bigger and moderates a little bit, it could, and we could be seeing this a little bit now, that they could potentially disappoint those that are faithful to the original vision. That may have inspired the Tea Party movement, which was a faction of the Republican Party. That could spring off into third parties. Again, very difficult in the United States system. But we are at an interesting time now where if a party fractures, we could see a shift to a different major party. Who knows what could happen? And then, of course, new parties could eventually grow up and replace the older or perhaps even the more moderated parties. Again, a little bit less likely in the United States, but if you've got a multi-party system, a party could spring up at pretty much any time, and then time will tell as to how it would grow or perhaps even start taking away members of an older party that may be too moderated to fit their more passionate views of the world. Okay, so those are the basics of the party, and then I will remind you as far as the quiz and what to prepare for on the quiz.